Welcome, everybody, into live coverage here on Coinage. I'm the host of Coinage, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studio in New York, where we will be streaming the live hearing in Washington, D.C. A big boy today. Dare I call it the Super Bowl in crypto? At least it seems that way. For the first time since 2019, we're going to see all 5 SEC commissioners testifying in front of the House Financial Services Committee in a hearing basically dedicated to digging into how the SEC has handled regulating markets, not just crypto, though we are expecting a big chunk of it to be dedicated to digital assets, specifically given all of the headlines we've seen ahead of the hearing and the way that congressmen and women have basically signaled that this may very well be a rebuke of the way that SEC Chair Gary Gensler has led that agency. So a lot to dig into today, and thank you for joining us. If you are joining us here now live on the stream, feel free to like and retweet or comment your biggest questions, because part of the reason why we do this is really context. Not everyone keeps up on all of the happenings as much as we do here at Coinage. It's a lot of sleepless nights, but thanks to our community who always keeps us in the know. And if you want to join what we're doing here at Coinage, you can always go to coinage.media and join the co-founder of Netflix and our more than 7,000 NFT holders in steering the direction of the only community-owned Web3 outlet here in the U.S. Important, of course, as it always is, to be here in the U.S., to know why hearings like this matter. And we can fill you in on the context because it's going to be juicy, methinks. Not only do you have SEC Chair Gary Gensler there in front of the House Financial Services Committee, but you're also going to have crypto mom Hester Peirce, who has joined us on Coinage in the past to talk about why she's kind of displeased, and she's been growing more and more displeased, to be fair here. There have been more and more pieces of dissent coming from crypto mom Hester Peirce in a lot of the statements that she's written up. The most recent example was an NFT restaurant in New York, Flyfish Club, that actually got hit with the $750,000 fine. And she came out and said, what are we doing? What are we doing here when we're finding NFT projects like a restaurant that's trying to offer membership to people and serving up omakase, basically saying we've kind of lost the plot here. And increasingly, we've also seen Congress fall in line with that view as well. It wasn't too long ago that they voted bipartisan. It was a bipartisan movement to rebuke not just the SEC, but also force President Biden into a position where he had to veto that legislation that basically would have sought to overturn SAB 121. We're going to hear a lot about that in this hearing. Again, if you're just joining us, we'll be taking the hearing live when it begins at 10 a.m. Eastern time, so about 13 minutes away from that hearing in the House Financial Services Committee. When it begins, we will take it live. I will step aside. But before we get into it, just kind of want to set up the context and why we're taking this hearing live and why I think it will matter today. As I mentioned, SAB 121 was that rule that basically said banks and other financial giants couldn't touch digital assets. There's a lot of kind of reasons as to why the SEC has been so forceful in making sure that custodying these assets are kind of basically right now limited to just the ETFs that they didn't want to approve in the first place. The only reason we got there is because Grayscale had sued the SEC and won, basically forced Gary Gensler's hands to approve the Bitcoin ETFs. And when you think about anything beyond it, you had a lot of people clamoring to say, hey, we want to custody those assets too. Let us in on the action. But they couldn't touch them because of SAB 121, essentially the rule that says any player in the space can't touch digital assets. And that all kind of changed once you heard politicians, including Chuck Schumer and a lot of Democrats, stepping up and saying, look, we will also pressure the SEC to turn around on that stance about face. And it was interesting because that was a crescendo moment in terms of when Republicans and Democrats came together to say, all right, maybe we're getting this wrong. Maybe the SEC truly is not helping anybody by doing this. And it became pretty clear when we had Hester Peirce on the show that she was going to get more vocal about SAB 121 not going the way she wanted. We're going to hear that today when all of the mics turn on down there in the House Financial Services Committee hearing. But to preview, I think, when we had Hester Peirce back on the show a couple months ago, she was talking about how disappointed she was that behind the scenes, the SEC was basically going to some of those financial giants and saying, look, we'll make exceptions to SAB 121 for you specifically. Everybody else who wants to get on the game, they're not allowed to. But let's just say JP Morgan, just to throw a name out there, potentially, not saying that it is JP Morgan, but let's just say there's a huge financial player on Wall Street who might want to get around Sob 121. What can you do for us, Gary Gensler and co? And that's where Hester Peirce said this is not really going the way that it should have gone. It's not meant to be special access for some people and everyone else gets blocked. But that's basically what she told us this had turned into. We'll play a quick clip from our interview with Hester Peirce just a few months ago. Come back and get ready for the hearing on the other side. Take a listen to what she told us not too long ago. I'm curious kind of what the new thinking around Sob 121 is at the SEC and how that maybe looks moving forward.
Well, I think that the process has been just terrible around Sob 121. The process for putting it out was terrible. It was a major, effectively, to me, looked like a rulemaking at the time, and it could have been done with input from the public, query whether it would have made sense maybe for FASB to be considering the issue instead of us. But in any event, we should have had a public comment period around it. We didn't. The attempt to overturn it didn't work, but even before that attempt to overturn it, there were expansions of Sob 121, and initially it was really about public companies, and then it started applying to broker dealers, and then there's all this guidance that's being provided orally around what broker dealers can and can't do, and now we hear about other kinds of accommodations or changes being made, and it's all being done in a very non-transparent way. I don't understand how that is beneficial for people. We have process for a reason, and we should be following process for Sob 121. It's been a very disappointing area for me, and I think we could do better, and I think we should do better. So again, I really don't like having things done developed in sort of negotiations that are behind the scenes, and I feel that's what I see happening here.
Now, obviously, that's not a good look because you don't want to just have the SEC calling winners and losers. That's not the whole point of what the agency is there to do. They're there to make sure people are following the rules. But in the case of crypto, they haven't really even laid out which rules are which makes it even trickier to really dig into how this should all be going in the right way. And I think we're going to hear quite a bit of that during this hearing when it begins. And again, as I said, it'll be the first time that we see all the other SEC commissioners up there with Gary Gensler. That hasn't happened in about 5 years. So seeing all the commissioners up there is kind of like a family reunion in that all the awkward and dirty laundry might be aired in front of the House Financial Services Committee, which is why we're taking this live to show everything in real time because no one knows what's going to happen. It's kind of the first time that we're going to see Gary Gensler flanked by Hester Peirce at a hearing like this. With congressmen and women who have grown increasingly dissatisfied with the way that the agency has been run. So again, not just crypto today. There will be other things thrown in there, but we figure, why the hell not? It's happening. It's out there. It's live on Coinage. I also want to flag Texas. I don't know if you can see right now my screen on the NDI, but okay, we can. Eleanor Terrett, who I was just down in D.C. with last week, actually. We were over at the Coinbase Stand with Crypto event down there. And she's just been flagging a little bit of what's been happening heading into this hearing, again, just to set the scene in terms of kind of what Republicans have been doing. And of course, they've mostly been leading the charge, whether it's Patrick McHenry or Tom Emmer, both key leading Republicans in the House, talking about Sob 121 and issuing a letter basically ahead of this hearing. Really doubling down on Sob 121 not being good and demanding that the agency rescind Staff Accounting Bulletin 121, which, of course, again, as we've seen before, is not necessarily super expected because it almost got to the point where everyone agreed that this is bad. And then President Biden had to step in to block the SEC and prevent it from happening. So regardless, there is another letter now being sent and asking them to rescind. So we'll see. Maybe I think that that'll be a huge talking point and why we're talking so much about Sob 121 ahead of this hearing. Outside of it, too, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out all the times that we caught Gary Gensler in these hearings red-handed. Again, the reason why we're taking this one live is because Gary Gensler is going to be there grilled with questions. And of course, our community always loves a good little fireworks if they're pointed in the direction or general vicinity of the SEC, and more specifically, Chair Gensler. And of course, we've seen that happen before. I can't remember if it was the Senate Banking Committee, which she was scheduled to appear in front of tomorrow, but it sounds like that one might be postponed to the Wednesday hearing. So there goes that one. But the last time we had him in front of one of these committees, we caught him in a little bit of a lie. And I think we've got that one queued up as well. It was basically the idea that so many people had said crypto was the problem when Silicon Valley Bank went down. It was crypto's fault that we've seen so many banking collapses. And Nick Carter's been covering a lot of this when it comes to Choke Point 2.0 and how much of this is still active, by the way, under the Biden administration, and really as the SEC has targeted the crypto industry here in the U.S. And you might say, as I did, that all sounds like a big conspiracy theory. I'm not so sure that the SEC or the banking regulators are really trying to kill this industry. Maybe they're just trying to follow the rules. And that may have been true up until the point where I saw Gary Gensler essentially get called out by New York's top banking regulator, saying that what he said literally the day before she was testifying under oath, by the way, that what he said was a lie. And that's where it kind of became clear that, all right, who are we really to trust in this space? If you got Gary Gensler out there saying that crypto was the reason why the banking collapse with Silicon Valley and others almost happened, and then the next day you've got New York's top banking regulator coming out and saying that it is not true that crypto had any role in that outsized beyond other industries, who are you supposed to believe? But I think it became clear that maybe Gary Gensler is not the one that would be at the top of that list. So we'll just play that as a best hits, if you will, as we put those two testimonies back to back. Take a listen to what we caught. I think this was back in April when Gary Gensler stepped to the mic last time and exposed him. Caught him red-handed. Take a listen.
Well, if I could just note something about you. You mentioned your hearing about the recent events in the markets, and I would note there were 3 banks that failed in those handful of days, those 4 or 5 days. And 2 of those banks, the first and the third that failed, Silvergate and Signature, were engaged in the crypto business. I mean, some would say they were, crypto banks. So it's interesting just how this was all had some crypto narrative as well.
It is a misnomer that the failure of Signature Bank was related to crypto. What we saw with Signature Bank is that it had a new-fashioned bank run, and the outflow of deposits were from a broad depositor base, including wholesale food vendors, fiduciaries, trust accounts, law firms. And in fact, the outflow of crypto deposits were in exact proportion to their representation in the depositor base overall. And in fact, some of those deposit outflows were actually pre-planned. So it's, of course, unfortunate that there was a run on the bank at Signature prompted by what we saw with SVB, but it is not the case that the failure of Signature was related to crypto.
There you go. Again, calling out Gary Gensler's take that crypto was the reason for the banking collapse that we saw with Silicon Valley Bank and all the others. And again, I think it's quite important to point out that a lot of this is challenged by other regulators. And it really does get to the heart of, I think, why a lot of the attack on crypto is not, as I've witnessed front and center, not a conspiracy theory to stretch into the reins, into the arena of Gary Gensler may quite honestly just be stretching the truth and, dare I say, lying for a lot of the facts that are in here. And a lot of people in crypto have called that out for a while. It hasn't really been that long ago that we've seen congressmen and women now, in a bipartisan sense, including Richie Torres, by the way, Democrat in New York, basically say that it has gone beyond just being dishonest. It's gone actively into the arena of, I think, now lying about a lot of what's been happening in crypto and not answering questions and being honest in that sense. When you have literally another commissioner at the SEC and Hester Peirce saying, look, we've continued to get things wrong, and now crossed over into publicly writing dissents in the way that the agency is policing crypto, I don't think it's a stretch at all. Listen to her. Don't listen to me. Anyways, outside of all that, it's not too long we have to go before this hearing begins. Scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., the hearing entitled Oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Again, the House Financial Services Committee, led by Representative Patrick McHenry, going to be kicking us off on this one. Maxine Waters, the Democrat to her left, essentially, also there leading this one in the back and forth that we're going to see play out. So I think it will be pretty juicy. If you have questions, hit us up, comment, reply, let me know what you have for us as we try and provide a little bit more context in all of this. By the way, outside of what we're doing today in the live stream, you can also go ahead and head to Coinage.media to look at all the big headlines that we have covered for you in the world of crypto. We try and accumulate them. We try and do whip around coverage, not just our articles, but coverage from around the space. It's good to keep everyone in the know. And you can subscribe to our Substack as well, which is always out there. We do it once a week to recap everything that we're seeing as the top stories to watch. This was certainly one of them, as we covered yesterday. We're about a minute away, folks, ladies and gents, from the House Financial Services Committee oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We can give you a live peek if you really want it, to take a look at what's going on right now. It's just a hold screen in this room 2128, where we are expecting the fireworks to begin shortly in Gary Gensler and the rest of the commissioners from the SEC testifying in front of the House Financial Services Committee. As I mentioned, it's the first time that we're really going to see Hester Peirce, Crypto Mom, and Gary Gensler flanked together there, along with the rest of the commissioners, grilled by congressmen and women on that committee to dig into why they are regulating crypto and the rest of the capital markets here in the U.S. in the way that they are. Outside of that, I think the thing to always watch for in these hearings is whether or not you're seeing new members of Congress. We already know Tom Emmer, we already know Patrick McHenry aren't going to be the ones that are fans of the way that the SEC has been regulating these capital markets. But we know less about Democrats on this committee and the way that they have. Certainly, we know a little bit more since they voted to overturn SOB 121. We saw that already with bipartisan votes in an increasing, I believe it was like 71 Democrats. I can't remember the full number as that vote played out. But it was a lot more than I think a lot of people expected when we covered that vote not too long ago. And even more in the Senate, where you basically had Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi both flip on their party and side with Republicans here and saying that the SEC has messed this up and that they've basically gotten regulating crypto completely wrong with SOB 121. So that was a pretty big moment in time. So we've seen kind of the evolution of both parties now saying maybe Gary Gensler and the SEC aren't getting this right. So whenever I watch these, I always think it's quite exciting to see whether or not we're going to see more Democrats kind of break with their ranks and whether or not anyone's changing their position, because that's how we win. It's things like this. It's advocating. It's educating. It's making sure that people know the facts, as we've tried to highlight in all the stretching of truths, in all the lies that have existed now, in the way that a lot of people are not representing crypto in a positive light. And interestingly, I was just down in DC. Let's talk about what we haven't talked about on the show, by the way, because I was just down in DC on a panel talking about crypto remittances, which, you know, Coinbase has been leading the charge on in terms of USDC trying to get stable coins around the globe. There's also legislation when it comes to stablecoins that's up in the air. No one really knows what's going to happen there. But being down in D.C. was a pretty eye-opening experience for me personally. As I was leading those panels, you had a bunch of pro-crypto congressmen and women who were down there at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute Conference. Shout out to CHCI for letting me moderate again for the third year in a row, representing Coinage and telling them how DAOs and cooperatives can be housed here in the U.S. in a legal way. Thank you very much to Coinage. But you also heard, as I did, and a lot of other people on the panel there, you heard congressmen and women coming out and saying that crypto is only used for crime, which fitting that we are hearing that narrative still today, almost a full 2 years removed from the collapse of FTX. Fitting that we're talking about that today, given the fact that Caroline Ellison's sentencing is later in the afternoon. If you hadn't seen our coverage on that, interesting that right now on Polymarket, you got about 50-50 odds that Caroline Ellison is sentenced to prison time. And yet, Bernie Madoff's former prosecutor just told us exclusively on Coinage that he basically has those odds at 0%. So if you're looking for a juicy way to play that one, he was basically saying, hey, how do I make money on this? I want to get involved here. And also clap back at all the bettors on Polymarket being wrong by saying most of those bettors probably aren't former federal prosecutors with 12 years experience. And he had us there. The resumes of the average Polymarket bettor, probably not a former federal prosecutor who took down Bernie Madoff. So if Mark Litt says she might not get prison time, I'm going to have to trust him maybe more than the 50-50 odds that we currently see on Polymarket. You can take that information and do with it what you will. But what I'm saying is it's a juicy day, not just for regulation, but also I think for the justice system to see kind of what we are to do. And hopefully after that ruling comes down, we can move past this idea of people thinking that crypto is still just used for crime, because obviously, if you're watching this right now, you're probably in the same camp as me, which is that it's not. Anyways, I'm excited to move on past that. I think a lot of people are. If you are watching this right now, throw a like on it. Throw a comment in here as we prep. As we look at it live, Texas, I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing, but it's 10:04, 4 minutes past the scheduled begin time. We are monitoring this hearing right now. It has not yet begun in room 2128 in Washington, D.C., as we're waiting to see the commissioners at the SEC turn on their mics and get ready to testify all together for the first time since when? 2019. That's when. We're going to see all the SEC commissioners in front of the House Financial Services Committee about 5 minutes past when they were supposed to begin, but this happens down in D.C., not outside the norms, to just see when they're going to start. When they do, though, as we've been describing, expect to see both a difference between Republicans and Democrats in terms of how they might approach whether or not the SEC has been doing a good job or bad. As we've seen recently, it's increasingly seen as a bad job in the way that there was a huge rebuke on SOB 121 and the idea of everyone just not getting this right. I do want to highlight, though, because we haven't discussed it too much, and since we have some time now, it seems, since they're taking a little bit longer. Let's see. Why don't we go to the other piece that we had prepared, which is the preview of this, because as I say, you know, we can talk about our view as much as we want, but quite astonishing to start to see Congress now basically adopt the pro-crypto view of, hey, look, maybe there is a problem here. And what we're about to show you isn't even a video that we produced. It's a video that the House Financial Services Committee, their media team, actually produced themselves. We're going to play that, and hopefully by the time the video is done, this hearing will have begun. But take a listen to how they've set up this hearing. I think it's pretty eye-opening in the way that they walk through SOB 121 and the idea of maybe the SEC not getting a lot of things right. They also bring up, by the way, coincidentally, the FTX collapse and what happened with Sam Bankman-Fried. So we're going to play this video. This came from the House Financial Services Committee themselves to preview this hearing last week. And now here we are, just minutes away from the SEC appearing together for the first time in 5 years in front of Congress to testify. Take a listen to the way that they've set up this hearing themselves.
FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried arrested in the Bahamas, set to face a judge this morning after U.S. prosecutors filed criminal charges in connection with the multi-billion-dollar collapse of his crypto company.
It's crypto's shining moment. A D.C. court ruling that the SEC was wrong to deny asset manager Grayscale's ETF proposal. It could be paving the way for the first ever spot Bitcoin exchange-traded fund.
Breaking news, the SEC now filing suit against Coinbase in Manhattan federal court. It says Coinbase has operated as an unregistered broker since at least 2019.
Under SEC Chairman Gary Gensler's leadership, the U.S. digital asset ecosystem has been mired by dysfunction and uncertainty. Woefully inadequate guidance and regulation by enforcement have led to turmoil in the marketplace, driving innovation offshore and jeopardizing critical consumer protections. To address this gap in regulatory clarity, lawmakers from the House Financial Services and Agriculture Committees teamed up to deliver an unprecedented joint effort to create a market structure for digital assets, the Financial Innovation and Technology for the 21st Century Act. FIT 21 will ensure consumer protection in the marketplace.
It is in Congress's interest to remedy the dispute between the CFTC and the SEC amidst $1 trillion of consumer harm. Foreign actors operating here domestically and consumers having their money taken. So we need to clarify this for consumer protection.
Under this bill, Americans can feel comfortable engaging with digital assets, knowing that this ecosystem is being brought under a time-tested regulatory umbrella.
Foster innovation in the U.S. digital asset ecosystem.
What we decide to do in this Congress this year will shape whether or not the digital asset ecosystem has the opportunity to thrive here in the United States. But right now, there's not a workable framework in place for digital asset issuers and intermediaries to be regulated effectively by the SEC or the CFTC.
We finally have the opportunity to harness and embrace this next generation of technology here in the United States, and we must seize this opportunity.
End regulation by enforcement.
The SEC and the CFTC have created an impossible situation where the same firms are subject to competing enforcement actions by the two different agencies. Absent legislation, our regulators are only pushing entrepreneurs, developers, and job creators offshore out of the U.S.
All right, and we're going to head to Washington, D.C. live, where Chair Patrick McHenry is now kicking off the hearing. Let's take it live.
Since 2019. A lot has changed since then in our markets, the broader economy, and at the SEC itself. Unfortunately, not for the better. Under Chair Gensler, the SEC has become a rogue agency. It routinely exploits its authority to the detriment of our capital markets, innovation, and the American people. Chair Gensler recently said, quote, "We at the SEC live within the laws as Congress passes them," close quote. Unfortunately, nothing could be further from the truth. Don't take my word for it. A wide array of federal judges appointed by presidents from both parties have noted that the lawless nature of Chair Gensler's tenure by overturning rulemakings and enforcement actions after enforcement actions it's overturned. This includes the proxy advisory rule, the private fund disclosure rule, the stock buyback rule, the debt box rule, Grayscale, Ripple, enforcement issues, the list goes on and on. It's not just for the courts to opine here. And it's not just the courts who've taken issue with Chair Gensler's reckless agenda. More than 250 members of Congress from both parties have signed letters, dozens of letters, in fact, opposing actions taken by the SEC. Chair Gensler's proposed a slew of major